So last class we talked about setting up a database with Heroku and then updating that database using SQL Alchemy code in Python. Now let's bring this all together in our app architecture and kind of make updates to that database using a flow between React and our Flask server. One thing you want to start out with before you ever test anything is make sure you have that environment variable. So here we're connecting to database URL. And if you don't set this, then you're going to have errors in connecting to the database. There's two ways to do it. One, you could just do export database URL and make that command in your bash terminal. I am going to go the long-term route and set this in an environment file. So you run Heroku config here, and it's going to tell you the config variables in your current app that we created last class. The only one you're going to see is database URL. And this URL here is what you actually want to copy and set to your environment variable. So to do that, I can create a new env file. So touch.env. I'm going to open up that env file with C9. And then here I'm going to set it. So I'm going to do database URL equals, and then I copied that big long Postgres URL and I'm putting single quotes around it. So we have that set now. And if I go back to app.py, I'm doing load.env, find.env, as well as os.getEnv. So this should take care of all the connections. One thing to remember though is on Heroku itself, we actually don't need to set the environment variables on Heroku. Because it's a Heroku database, it automatically is going to have this database URL set inside of its app. So this is just for local testing. Now let's run the app. So I'm in my terminal, start out with python app.py. Then I'm going to create a new terminal, cd into React starter, and then do npm run start. So take a second, let that start up. Okay, it started. I'm going to refresh here. We see the chat messages app that we were showing in our last class about Socket. And I'm just going to open this up into a browser and open up my developer tools as well in the console so I can see anything I'm printing. Okay, and I'll actually do it twice just because we are communicating between multiple clients. All right. So let's talk about our database first. If you remember from last class, we had this models.py file, which was defining the schema of our database. So this class here, and there can be multiple classes, one for each table. Right now, we just have one. This table is going to be called person. It's going to have 3 columns in it. One is ID, which is automatically set as the primary key, and then username and email, which have to be unique and are strings. So those are 3 columns. And in the code here, we're basically connecting to our database URL. We are initializing this DB variable in order to update the database in our code. We're importing models. So this is kind of the schemas. And then we're doing db.createAll, which is automatically going to create any of the tables we've defined in models if they're not already created. In my case, they are, so it wouldn't do anything, but we're just putting this at the top so it runs every time we start our server. Now, what do we want to do here? Let's see what we can show inside of our chat messages app using our person database. Well, one thing that could be cool is just showing like a list of all the users, kind of like a user history of all the people that have joined this kind of chat room in the past. And obviously, we don't want to just look at it in terms of the current session. We want to see all the users in the past, which is why we need to persist this in a database. So when I first enter my app, maybe I want to be able to see that list automatically before I've kind of done anything. If that's the case, why don't we first grab this data inside of this database right now and then pass it to the front end to show. So how can we do that? Well, in order to query the database, there is something called um, models.person.query.all. And you could do it different ways. So you could do like the filter if you want to see only certain people in your database, things like that. And this is going to return a list of objects. Each object is one person inside of your database. If you remember from last class, we added admin and guest to this list when we were testing it out. Now, I actually want to show this on the UI though. So one useful way is by basically making the server tell the client what this full list is so the client can then display it. I want to show this as soon as the user kind of loads up this page. So a good place to put that could be in your socket.onConnect. This is saying when a client has connected to the socket to the server, then we're going to be running some code here. So right now we're just running print user connected. Let's also run some more stuff. So we can actually emit an event, and this is how we are basically giving some information from the server down to the client. We only have this database information about DB in the server, so we have to pass it through a socket event. So I'm going to do socket.emit. I'm going to make an event called user list. So I just made this name up. Again, you make up your event names based on like what kind of makes sense and like what data you're passing down and what like the action is. So this is user list. And then you have to pass in a dictionary, which is kind of like JSON. So I'm thinking that I could do users here as the key, and then the value would be some list that I want. What is that actual list? So this is where we need models.person.query.all. So this can be all people, and this will be kind of the sort of list of people that's returned by your database. And this is going to be an object. So I only want the user names right now. In models, we have IDs and emails as well, but let's just keep this simpler. So if I wanted to do that, I could do for person and all people. And then I could, so actually create a new list. So let's call this users. Let's start it out as empty. And then let us add to that list. And what we're just going to add is person.username. So person is an object, one kind of person instance of this class. And within that, you can do person dot something like person.id, person.username, person.email in order to access its fields. So I'm doing person.username, and then I've added it to this list. So this is now a list of usernames. And then this is what I actually want to pass down to the client. And it's always good to be printing out stuff to make sure that things are showing up as you would expect. So we'll print it here too. Okay. Why don't we just run the app and make sure first that when the user connects, we are successfully grabbing all these people in our database and then looping through and getting the usernames so that we can emit it. So I'm going to refresh here and let's see what happens. So sometimes you might not see a change when you change app.py's socket listeners. If that's the case, then you would have to restart the terminal. So I'm going to restart. On the other hand, if you make changes on the JavaScript side, you can be pretty confident that when you save, it'll automatically refresh on the UI. Okay, so I've restarted, and now let us try reconnecting. And actually, when I see appear, you're going to see user connected, and then you're going to see this list here. So this is the list of names, and you see admin here. So you should see admin and guest because you added those last time. And then this is just from testing. You're going to see like, you're not going to see this, but I see a ton of other names that I've tested in the past. Okay, so we're successfully getting this list of people from our database. We passed it down to our client, but nothing's happening on the client yet. And that's because the first step is we need to actually be listening for this kind of event. So in order to do that, you have to have these socket.on calls inside of your use effect. I'm going to add a new one here just by copy pasting. So I want to do socket.on, and then my event name is user list. So I'm going to put user list here. And then data is just an argument. So this function here is a callback saying we're going to run this function whenever we hear this event. And the first argument we can assume is going to be whatever is passed in as the data. So this whole object right here from the server. So remember, data is not just a list. Data is an object where the key is users and the value is a list. That's how we've written it here. And you should always log it. So just print it out on the console so we can make sure that we are seeing the correct data. So I'm going to say user list event received, and then take all this crap out. And then let's try it again. So let me refresh over here. And then when I refresh, remember, we're emitting this event on connect. So I'm going to see user list event received. And then I have an object. So this is an object notation where the key is users, the value is an array. That array, I can then open it up and I can see for each index what the value is. And this is great. This is the same list that I would expect here. So we now have this list on the client inside of our JavaScript. Now let's actually render it in the UI. So all we've done is logged it. We haven't actually displayed it in any way. And you know that because you don't see anything in our return statement about our user data. Well, first thing is, one question to always ask is like, do I need state variables in order to kind of store this information and show it on the UI? The benefit and like when you're going to want to use state is for two things. So one, I don't actually have access to this data outside of the scope of this function, this tiny callback that I've written here in socket.on. So let's say I wanted to do something here, data.map, blah, blah, blah. You're going to see data is not defined because this variable is only in this function. That's why you need like a global variable that you can set this data to. So that's one case where state is useful. And then the second thing that you need to satisfy, or second kind of requirement is this user list data going to be something that updates over time? And when it updates, do I want it to automatically show on the UI in its updated form? So in my case, actually, I'm getting this user list on the first time I connect, and you're not going to connect again. So you don't necessarily need state, but in the future, I could see myself adding some functionality where as soon as some user logs in, let's say like I log in or somebody else logs in, then I want that list of users to automatically update. And I want that list to update on the UI as well. So if you think about milestone 1, we were talking about showing active users and like updating that list live. That's a good case for storing that in state so that you can React can manage that and update it for you. So let's create a new state variable here. You're going to start with use state and then initialize it. In my case, I want to initialize it as an array. This is because I want to store a list of users. So an array is a list, and that's kind of makes the most sense. But remember, you could be doing a Boolean state variable. You could be doing a number for a counter. You can do whatever you want. I'm doing an array though, because that makes the most sense here. And then in this array, you're kind of defining, or in the array that's returned, you're defining two things. One is the state variable. So I'm going to call it user list. And then 2 is the function that lets you update that state variable. So I'm going to call this set user list by convention. Okay. So we have our state set up, but now let's actually update that state variable when we get some new data in. So it's starting out empty, right? Well, we need to tell React that we want to change it from empty to our user list when we've gotten a new socket event. So to do that, you use that function that they gave you. set user list, and then you can pass in the new list. So I could pass in my socket data. Remember though, data, that argument is an array. Or it's an object, sorry. So it's not just an array, it's an object where, or sort of like a dictionary where the key is users, the value is an array. So to access the array inside of that object, you would need to do something like data dot users, and then that would return the array. So what I'm doing now is I'm just replacing my value user list with the new value, which is passed from the server. Okay, cool. So let's try refreshing. We're getting the user list, but I don't actually see anything showing up on the UI still. So what's up with that? Well, we haven't done the final step, and you have to make sure you do this if you want to see something in the UI. This return statement at the end of the function component is saying what is the actual HTML that you're displaying on the web page. Nowhere am I using user list inside of this HTML. So I'm seeing messages here. So I'm showing all the messages. If I typed in a new message, that would pop up. But nowhere am I talking about user list. So in order to do that, let's actually add on some new elements here. I usually like to do a div when I'm doing kind of a new block. In this case, I want to separate this from like messages stuff. I want to talk about users. So let's create a new header. I'm going to call it all users history. So we're kind of showing all the users that have been a part of this chat app in the past. And then let's actually show that list. So to show that list, this is where this map function can come in handy. All map is doing is it's basically taking your original array, so user list, and then creating a new array based on that original array. And I want to take my list of strings and map it to a list of components that are actually going to show a list element on the screen. So to do that, you can do user list.map. This is kind of your two variables that are two kind of arguments that are given in the map function. You can think of it similar to doing like for item in user list. So if we do that, then you have access to item, which is basically each element that it's looping through at the given time. I could call this user to make it even more clear. And then I just want to create a list item from each user. So I could do name is user, key is index. And now we're basically creating bullets, one bullet per user that we can then actually render on the screen. So I save there, and now you're going to see this list actually pop up finally. So that's great. This is kind of what we've been hoping for. If you show it here too, now you're automatically seeing this show up. And if I do a hard refresh, then you might notice that the message went away because we've started a new session. But the user history is always going to show up at the beginning. And this is because we're storing this in the database. So it's always remembering all the users that have come in. Okay, so let's do one last thing now. We have just kind of been showing the user list that we were storing, so like admin and guest maybe, but we haven't actually given a UI for new people to join this list, basically, to say, hey, I'm a new user, I want to be a part of this list, I want to be stored in the history of users that came to this app. So we're going to need some UI for this. It's going to look very similar to how we kind of send a message. Let's basically copy paste that and put it in this div here. And I'm actually going to move it into the underneath the header. Okay. So it says enter message here, but that's not what I want to do. So I'm going to say enter username here. And then I'm going to want to say something like maybe log in, or maybe I can say join. And now the user can see, oh, here's where I put in my username to join like this history of all the people that have come to this app. Okay, there's two things missing though. So one, I'm kind of copying the same input ref that I used in the previous input right here. And then two, I'm copying the same on-click button function that I'm using when I click send. But I don't want to do that right now. I want to have a separate flow for clicking this stuff. So let's just copy input ref and create a new one. I'm going to call this like join ref. And then you can set that here as the reference variable. And this is just going to allow you to more easily access whatever you've typed in here. And then let's create a new function instead of on-click button. And let's say this is called on-click join. And we're going to use very similar logic here. So we want to make sure that the join ref is not null, that we've set it correctly. And then we want to grab the current value of join ref. So if right now I typed in nama, then that would be the current value when I click join. And I can call that username instead of message, because now we're not dealing with messages. And then finally, the last thing I might want to do is emit this to the server. So we have to let the server know that somebody has joined. And then we want to actually add this to our real database. So we can do that. We can create a new event that we want to emit. Let's say it's called join. And then let's pass up the username. And again, this is data that we're passing up kind of as a dictionary. The key is username, but it could be anything. And then the value is username, the variable here. So I could also say this is like user, and that would be the same sort of syntax. Okay, and then let's set on click join here on the button that I'm clicking when I press join. Cool. So we've emitted an event, but now let's actually listen to this event on the server. So now we're going backwards from the client back to the server. I want to create an event listener on this side of things. So that's the only way that you can know that this event has actually been emitted and catch it. The event that we're emitting is called join. So I'm going to call that join here. And we know, so I'm going to change this function here to on join. And then we know that this data, this argument here, is going to be mapped to this object or dictionary that we passed up from the client. So we would expect there to be the key with the user and then the value with the actual username. And then we print it out here. It's always good to print it out as a sanity check. So let's just make sure that when I do that, that something actually happens. When you create a new listener, again, you might need to restart. So I'm just going to do that preemptively. I'm going to do npm run start. Okay. I'm going to refresh, and then let's try adding in my name. So I'm going to call it just a new name. And let's see what happens. Okay. So you should see it pop up somewhere here. I think that this wasn't refreshed, so it didn't show up, but I tried it on a new tab and new name 1 did show up here. So we're catching the event now on the server. And then there's one final step here. I actually want to add this now to the same database that we've been building for people. So how can we do that? Well, the first thing you need to do is so I'm just going to delete these comments. I'm going to call this new user. And then you're going to create an instance of the person class. So the username you can set to data user. So It's called user here. I'm going to say data user. That's the username. It requires an email actually. So I am just going to say, let's see, I can do data, or let's say, I can just make an email up, but based on the username, because it does have to be unique. So I could say 0 at stuff.com, and then do format. So I'm going to do a string format and pass in my username. So this is just if I joined with like new name one, then it would set the email to new name one at stuff.com. And this is just because I don't want to create a new flow to type in your email to. That would just take longer. So we're just going to go with this to fill in that data. Okay, so I have a new user here of the person class. I need to actually add it to my database now. So you would do db.session.add new user. And then you would have to do db.session.commit. So this is officially recording those changes. Think of commit in like Git terms as well. You do something similar. So we should have added it now. And then let's just make sure that we see our new user. So I want to get all people again. So let's do a query for the table once we've committed. And then let's just print out what we're seeing here and make sure that this is what it looks like. So let's test this out. I'm just going to say new join. And when I click that, we're going to see what we printed here. So on the join event, we are printing out the data. So that is user and then the username new. We're adding it to our database, this new person. And then we're querying that full database and seeing all the results. And when I see all the results, I'm going to actually see all the stuff I've been showing in the past, like admin, num1, and stuff. And then at the very end, I'm going to see person new. So that's perfect. We've actually successfully added this to the database now. The final step is to actually, with this updated database, I want this to automatically update on the UI. Right now, we're only giving the user list when a user connects. And after that, we're not giving them any updated user list. So how can we fix this? Well, it's good that we're showing it when they connect, but whenever anybody joins, let's also emit that same event with our user list. So I'm just going to copy this right here, this whole code, and I am going to paste that in. So we're querying all the people, we're adding the username property to that list, and then we want to return this list to the UI. So I'm going to emit this now. Let's restart one last time. Restart Python, restart npm. And what will we expect? So now what I would expect is on the initial load, I'm seeing all the people I've been saving. So new is now added there because we're persisting data. And then I want to expect that kid who just joined, when I press join, I should expect this to automatically show up on the UI now because we're mapping every single user from our user list here. And this should actually show up on everybody's accounts, so everybody's page, because we're emitting a socket event to all the clients. So let's try that. It shows up here and it shows up here. And that's perfect because if you see here, we're listening for that same event that we've emitted now in a second place. And we're just updating the state value with that new list.